Welcome, students. Today we are going to be looking at the theory of international trade. The theory of international trade is normally it falls under international trade, the topic, and the theory of international trade seeks to explain the benefits of international trade. See, this theory it explains that countries engaging in international trade will concentrate where their cost of production is lowest, so that they shall have most efficient use of their resources. So, this theory, as other theories, is based on some assumptions. These assumptions cover all the theory, that's the theories under the theory of international trade. So, these assumptions that are broad assumptions, and they cover all the theories. So we'll look at the first. There are only two countries in the world. According to this theory, for the case of simplification, or to make it understandable, they have limited the amount of countries to two countries in the world. It's a hypothetical situation, so it should not seem strange to you. The next, there are only two goods which are produced. Also, for simplification, we have limited the amount of goods to two goods produced. Can be any two goods. Can be any two goods. It can be cars and houses. Can be plants. Any two goods. And also the countries can be any two countries. So we can name any two countries and use as for example. Next assumption: there is no barrier, or there are no barriers to transport cost. So no barriers, nor transport costs exist in this theory, in this hypothetical situation. So no barriers to trade internationally, and no transport costs. There's no additional cost on goods because of the cost of transportation. So exports have the same price as when they are sold domestically, and there are no barriers like tariffs and embargoes to limit exportation and importation. So exportation and importation are to the fullest, with no limits and restrictions. Next we'll look at is resources remain fixed in both countries. So in both countries, I said there are two countries. That's the first assumption. So in both countries, the resources remain fixed. With this condition, if one country can produce more of a given good, it's not because it is more efficient, and it is not because it has greater amount of resources. So in this situation, when a country produces more goods, it's because it is more efficient. It is able to produce more with that particular amount of resources, and not because more resources have been the country has more resources normally. Next factor we'll look at is perfect mobility of resources in both countries. There's perfect mobility of resources in both countries. All the resources within a country can be transferred from one industry to another, so that specialization is not hindered by factors of production, immobility of factors of production. So land, labor, and capital can easily be transferred from all of it or some of it from one industry to another. Number 6, constant returns to scale as output changes. So this means that as a unit of resource is moved away from one industry to another, a given amount of one commodity will be lost, and a given amount of another commodity will be gained. So moving resources from one industry, say cars, to another industry, tea producing industry, example, a given amount of cars produced will be lost, units of cars will be lost, and a given amount of units produced of tea will be gained, or tons of tea produced will be gained. So constant returns to scale. This is a constant amount which is lost and gained by either of the industries. It does not change. The last assumption: full employment of resources in both countries. So assuming any resource given to any country, it is assumed that the country will make full use of all the resources. So there's full employment of all resources. So all resources available are assumed to be fully used, so that the country should not produce less because it is underutilizing its resources. So Based on these assumptions, we are trying to look at how a country can benefit best or gain from international trade. Based on these assumptions, we are going to look at two main ways. That's if a country is producing, or each country produces one good only. So how would they benefit from international trade? Considering all these assumptions, there are two countries given. So let's look at a case where each country produces only one good. You see that international trade will be necessary because both countries will benefit from variety. If a country produces a particular good, the next or the other country produces another one. When they enter trade or involve in trade, you see that there will be a benefit of variety because each country can consume. If each country were to consume only what it produces, one country will be consuming a particular good and you will not be able to consume the other. But variety now enters or comes into play when international trade occurs. So the next we're looking at is where each country can produce two goods. So international trade, beneficial international trade can also be done in the case where each country can produce two goods. So we'll look at two cases of this, or two theories. First, the Adam Smith absolute advantage theory, and next the David Ricardo's comparative advantage theory. Excuse me, it is comparative advantage theory. So excuse me, it's David Ricardo's comparative advantage theory. We'll end at these two theories here in this under O-level syllabus. So moving forward in further studies, you see many other theories under other cases. So I'll look only at these two, where each country produces a good or one good, and the second one where each country can produce two goods. And under this caption falls these two theories. We'll start with the first, Adam Smith's absolute advantage theory. So with this, we look under Adam Smith's absolute advantage theory. He believes that he comes up with something called absolute advantage, and it is the ability of a country to produce more of a given good than other countries using the same amount of resources or using fewer resources even. So Adam Smith came up with the absolute advantage theory. We'll try to look at understanding more, so we'll look at it on diagrams. On a diagram, we'll assume two countries. As I said, from the assumptions, we'll name the countries. One is country A and country B. Assume two goods that can be produced by these countries. So the countries can produce either cars or tea. So cars and tea are the goods that are produced. So on the table, we'll look at the countries, country A and country B. Under resources, we'll first of all assume given one resource. So 1x resource to each of them, 1x to A and 1x to B. So 1x is like one resource to A and one resource to B. So with this particular amount of resource or resources, A can produce either in cars, in units, either 100 units of cars, or in tons, 200 tons of tea. So with 1x resources, A can produce either 100 units of cars or 200 tons of tea. Moving to B, using the same one resource, B can produce either 50 units of cars or 300 tons of tea. Just from looking at this, you see that under cars, only cars, A produces 100, B produces 50, but they are using the same 1x resources. So A has an absolute advantage of producing cars than B. Also under T, with the same one resource, A can produce only maximum 200 tons of tea, while B can produce 300 tons with the same 1x resource. So you see, just from looking at it, B has an absolute advantage of producing tea than A. So now we'll look at the domestic opportunity cost ratios with respect to cars. Domestic opportunity cost ratio, that's the meaning of DOCR, So with this, for domestic opportunity cost ratio for cars, that's how much of T will be forgone to produce one extra unit of cars, so or 1 unit of car. So look at other countries, the to see how much will be forgone of T to produce cars. We divide through by the value of cars by 100. So divide through by 100. Divide 100 and 200 by 100. We get 1:2. So for each unit of car that is produced, 2 tons of T are forgone. So this is just the meaning of domestic opportunity cost ratio. We'll look at that of country B. So we'll try to look at domestic opportunity cost ratio with respect to cars. So we'll try to see, we'll divide both sides by 50, the value of cars. So we'll get 1:6. So it means in the case of country B instead, 6 tons of T are forgone to produce just 1 unit of cars. That's, you see the difference between A and B. So we'll look at the totals, the resources. So if you add the total resources, 1x plus 1x will give you 2x. Add the total amount of cars produced in the end, that's cars for A 100 and cars for B 50, give you 150 cars produced in the end. And then for T, you get 200 produced by country A, 300 produced by country B. 200 plus 300 is 500. So total amount of T which can be produced is 500. So looking at this is the total amount of T which can produce 500 and the total amount of cars which can produce 150. So we're trying now to look at a case where we have seen for one resource, given 1x of resources to each country. Let's look at the case where each country is given 2 resources, so it's 2x resources. And this case, we'll begin with the case of self-sufficiency, where a country decides to produce all the goods available to it with these 2 resources. So it does not produce a particular good or another one, it produces both with 2 resources. So allocating 50% to each industry, so each industry gets 1 resource. So cars will get 1 resource, Tea will get 1 resource. So the country can produce both cars and tea. That's self-sufficiency. So countries, note that this case is where international trade is not carried out. So country A and country B, resources given to it will give them 2 resources, 2x resources each. Look at for cars now, country A can produce 100 units of cars with 1 resource, because country A is sharing 50% of its resources among cars and tea. So 1 will go to cars, 1x, and 1x of resources can produce 100 of cars, as we saw earlier, and 1x of resources too can produce 200 tons of tea. So country A produces both these 100 of units of cars and 200 tons of tea, and does not involve itself in international trade. Country B produces 50 units of cars and 300 units of tea. So you see, this is what happens with self-sufficiency given 2 resources. We look at the total amount of resources is 2x plus 2x resources for A and B, countries A and B, give you 4x resources. For cars, the total amount of cars produced in the end is 100 for country A and 50 for country B. It'll give you 150 cars produced. And that of tea, total is 200 plus 300, will give you 500 tons of tea produced. So with this, we look now at the case. We have looked at the case of self-sufficiency where there's no international trade. We're trying to look at the advantage of international trade. So we look at the case where these 2 resources are allocated to where the country has an absolute advantage, and then international trade will then be carried out. So this is the case of specialization in the industry with absolute advantage. Look at country A and B. Look at the resources, 2x and 2x. These 2x resources now will be, all of these 2x will go to a particular industry where the country has an absolute advantage. We saw earlier, country A has an absolute advantage in the production of cars, because with given one resource, country A can produce 100 units of cars, but country B, given one resource, can produce only 50 units of cars. So country A will use all these 2x resources in the production of cars. So it's 2 times 100 give you, for cars, country A will produce 200 cars, 2 times 100, and it will produce no tons, 0 tons of tea, because it has specialized all its resources on cars. Country B, on the other hand, has an absolute advantage in the production of tea. So it will produce 0 units of cars and specialize all its resources in the production of tea. So it produces, with one resource, it produces 300 tons of tea. So with 2, it will produce 2 times 300, it will give 600 tons of tea. We look now at the total. Given the total amount of resources have not changed. So it's 2x plus 2x for country A and country B, and it's give 4x. But look at how many units of cars now are produced. 200 units of cars are produced, and tea, 600 tons of tea are produced. So you see, the total amount of cars produced has increased. So this is beneficial to society. That increased from 150 to 200, and the total amount of tea has increased from 500, which it was, to 600. So there's a total amount of 50 units of cars benefited or added, and 100 tons of tea added. So this international trade now is beneficial. After this, they can carry out international trade, and you see that an amount of what they are producing has increased. International trade now is carried out within some specific boundaries, because looking at the domestic opportunity cost ratio with respect to cars, because 2 tons of tea were forgone by country A to produce 1 unit of car, you see that country A will not accept less than these 2 units of, or these 2 tons of tea from country B for one of its cars. Because if it accepts less than that, it means that it is making a loss. So country A will accept from 2 tons upwards. 2 tons upwards from country B of tea for one of its cars. On the other hand, country B can forgo, if country B were to produce cars, it will forgo 6 units of tea. Now that it's producing tea, you see country B would not accept to give more than 6 tons of tea, its tea, in exchange for one of country A's cars. Because if it wants to produce cars, it will forgo 6 tons of tea. So why will it involve in international trade with a country which will instead make it forgo more than 6 tons of tea, when it can just self-sufficiently produce cars and lose 6 tons of tea? Why will it involve itself in international trade and instead lose 7 tons of tea? So you see the exchange rate, the exchange rate will lie between 1:2 for country A and 1:6 for country B. So this is what we have seen now. That's the 1 car will exchange from 2 to 6 tons of tea and no more between these 2 countries in international trade. I'll look at the next theory now, the David Ricardo's comparative advantage theory. Comparative advantage is the ability of a country to produce a product at a lower opportunity cost than other countries. You see, the theory of international trade is actually based on the principle of comparative advantage. This is because even when a country has absolute advantage in all the 2 industries, specializing according to principle of comparative advantage will still increase the output of the 2 countries, so it will still be necessary. We'll look at our cases with the very countries A and B and the very amount of resources, so, and the very industries, cars and teas. So we're looking at country A and country B given one resource, as we saw in the first, case, assuming country A can produce 100 units of car given one resources, or produce 400 tons of tea, and country B given one resource can produce 50 units of cars or 300 units of tea. We are trying now to look at the total. We see the total resources 2x, the total amount of cars produced 150 or 700. We look now at the domestic opportunity cost ratio. Here we are looking at with respect to cars and tea because we are looking at the comparative advantage. So it is looking at the opportunity cost. You see, with respect to cars, for country A, you divide both sides by the value of cars 100, so it will give you 1:4. So you will say, with respect to cars, country A will lose 4 cars to produce 1 unit of, lost 4 tons of tea to produce 1 unit of cars. So with respect to tea, for country A again, we'll divide all through by 400, that's the value for tea now. So this will give 1:1/4. So it means that if country A was to produce tea, it will lose 1/4 unit of cars to produce 1 ton of tea. I hope you get it. We're looking at the next with B. Divide both sides, the same process, divide both sides for the value of cars by 50, so it will give you 1:6. Country B will lose 6 tons of tea to produce 1 unit of car, and with respect to tea, divide both sides by 300, 1:1/6. So country B will lose 1/6 units of cars to produce 1 ton of tea. So now that we've seen this, we're looking at given 2 resources now. Given 2 resources to both countries and 50% allocated to each industry. We're looking at the case of self-sufficiency as we saw before first. We look at for country A and B, the resources 2x now and 2x now. So cars in units. Self-sufficiency means they'll produce everything. They'll produce cars and tea. So country A will produce 100 units of car and produce 400 tons of tea. Country B will produce 50 units of car and 300 tons of tea. We look at the total 4 resources, 4x resources, total of cars, 150 units of cars, and total of tea, 700 units of tea. We're looking at the case, this we have seen self-sufficiency. We want to look now at specialization with these 2 resources, these 2x resources. So country A and country B again, resources 2x and 2x. Cars in units, country A will produce 200 units of cars, assuming country A specializes in the production of cars. So because it has an absolute, country A specializes in the production of cars because it has a comparative advantage. That means the amount it forgoes of tea to produce cars is lower than the amount country B forgoes of tea to produce cars. So it has a comparative advantage. It specializes in cars. So 2 resources times the amount it uses to produce, then times the amount of cars it produces with 1 resources. So it's 2 times 100, 200. And for tea, 0. Rather for country B, since it has a comparative advantage in the production of tea, that's why looking at domestic opportunity cost ratio. That means you see for country B, when it wants to produce tea, it loses a smaller amount, 1/6 amount of unit of cars, than country A, which loses 1/4 or 1/4 unit of cars to produce 1 ton of tea. So it specializes in tea, so it's 2 times 300, which will produce 600. So look at the total. Given these 4x resources, there's a total of 200 cars produced and a total of 600 tons of tea produced. So you see, this case, it's advantageous in the production of cars, but you see, in the production of tea, it somehow drops. But there's a case which is not for this level, which will give advantage to both the production of cars and tea, and this is the case of partial specialization. This is for advanced level, but I'll just give you a glimpse of it so that you should get a little about it. So looking at partial specialization, producing the countries A and B, producing the resources, given 2x resources to both of them. Assuming country A, since it has an absolute advantage in both the production of cars and tea, but it has a comparative advantage in production of car. If you divide this is 2 resources between cars and tea, but put more resources to cars because it has both comparative and absolute advantage in cars. So let's give it, out of these 2 resources, let's give 1.7 to cars. So 1.7 times 100 will give 170 resources produced by cars for country A, and for tea it produces the rest of the 2 resources, that's 0.3 times 400, 120 tons of tea. So country A produces these 2. Country B now, since it has only a competitive advantage in tea and no absolute advantage in cars, so it produces only tea. So all its 2 resources times 300, 600. You see the total amount of goods produced, even with the very 4 resources, total amount of cars will be 170 and total amount of tea will be 720. So you see, with these 4 resources, 4x resources, now there's a total of 170 units of cars produced, and this is more than what was produced, the 150 that was produced, and it's also more than the 700 that was produced at first. So you see, in the case of partial specialization, there is benefit to both cars and tea, but this is A-level work, so don't bother about it too much. So goodbye, and look at the following references for further information: www.google.com or www.wikipedia.org. So goodbye, and remember, as I always say, thumbs up to hard work and thumbs down to laziness.